The moment Commander Kincaid tore my perfect target sheet into pieces and threw them into the dust, he thought he was erasing my future, completely unaware that 40 heavy rifles hidden along the ridge were already trained on his chest. I kept my cheek pressed against the cold composite stock of my long-range weapon, my breathing perfectly steady while my spotter whispered the classified code that finally unlocked the encrypted files from the night my entire squad vanished in the mountains. For 6 agonizing months, I endured the sneers and public humiliation of men who believed a woman had no place in an elite tactical unit, framed as a coward by the very officer now trembling in the desert heat before me. As Kincaid shouted into the wind and declared my impossible 1,800-meter shot an official failure, the synchronized acoustic thunder of 40 rifle bolts racking live rounds echoed against the canyon walls. The arrogant commander turned pale when he realized the hidden operators perched above us were not answering to his authority, but waiting for my signal to expose the truth about the cold murder of my team. He believed he was standing over a ruined subordinate in an empty valley, utterly blind to the federal agent stepping out of the transport vehicle with handcuffs ready. But as his knees buckled and the torn paper fluttered around his boots, my spotter whispered a final warning that made my blood run cold, revealing that the real traitor was not standing on the range at all. The torn paper drifted into the pale Nevada sand, but my hand on the custom composite stock of my rifle did not tremble by a single millimeter. My eye remained glued to the crystal-clear glass of my night vision-capable optical sight, my heart beating at a slow, deliberate 40 beats per minute. Across the sun-scorched flats of the testing grounds, Commander Kincaid stood breathing heavily, his pristine dress uniform stained with sweat, his face twisted in a mask of bureaucratic fury. He had spent 6 months trying to erase me from the unit, trying to prove that a woman could never survive the extreme pressure of long-range interdiction operations. When my bullet cut clean through the 3-inch kill box on an impossible 1,800-meter target in front of observers from Washington, his reality shattered. He didn't just reject the score. He marched up to the frame, ripped the paper to shreds, and threw the evidence into the dust. "You fail, Chief Brooks," Kincaid shouted, his voice cracking against the dry limestone canyon walls surrounding the valley floor. The target was improperly secured. Environmental parameters were unverified. The qualification is null and void. He thought he was standing over a defeated subordinate. He thought he had successfully buried the truth about the quiet woman who had spent years outperforming every man who scoffed at her presence in the command structure. What Kincaid did not realize, as he stood there sneering at my prone body, was that the silence hanging over the desert range was not empty. High above us, embedded in the jagged granite alcoves and dry scrubland overlooking the firing line, 40 concealed positions were watching through heavy precision optics. They were the men of Task Force Echo, elite marksmen who spoke only in wind calls, elevation adjustments, and bullet drops. They had watched Kincaid's arriving motorcade with cold detachment, and they had listened to every word of his manufactured exercise through encrypted tactical channels. A sharp, metallic sound broke the dead silence of the range. Clack, clack. It was quiet at first, precise and utterly unmistakable. Then another echoed from a rocky ledge 300 yards to our left. Clack, clack. Within 3 seconds, the sound multiplied, cascading across the canyon walls in a synchronized acoustic wave of raw power. Clack, 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 clack. It was the terrifying sound of 40 heavy rifle bolts being violently cycled in unison, locking live armor-piercing rounds into the chambers of weapons trained directly on the valley floor. Kincaid froze instantly. The arrogant sneer vanished from his face, replaced by a ghastly pale panic as the sound of 40 chambered rounds settled over his shoulders like an executioner's shroud. He looked toward the barren rocks, his breathing coming in shallow, ragged gasps, suddenly realizing that the unseen phantoms in the hills were not responding to his authority. My spotter, Master Chief Garrison, leaned close to my ear without shifting his gaze from his spotting scope. "The encrypted transmission from the northern mountain pass just decrypted," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the hot desert wind. It wasn't an enemy mortar crew that wiped out your original squad 6 months ago. The digital frequency signature belongs to Kincaid's private transmitter. My fingers tightened around the trigger shoe. The man standing 10 feet away from me was not just a narrow-minded bureaucrat trying to ruin my military career because of my gender. He was the murderer who had left my entire 4-man reconnaissance element burned and buried in an icy alpine trench, framing me for negligence while he signed off on millions of dollars in missing military hardware. And as 2 black sport utility vehicles with tinted windows pulled onto the gravel range, blocking his only path of escape, Kincaid realized that the game he had played for 6 years was finally over. The road that led me to that scorched firing line in the Nevada desert did not begin with polished brass buttons, grand speeches, or high-ranking political ambition. It began in a small northern logging town nestled against the jagged tree line of the Cascade Range, where winter lasted 7 months out of the year and survival depended entirely on quiet endurance. My family lived in a modest timber frame house 3 miles outside the main settlement, where the air always carried the sharp, clean scent of crushed pine needles and damp earth. My father spent 40 years as a heavy equipment mechanic at the local lumber mill, his hands permanently stained with dark industrial grease and marked by deep, pale scars from working with heavy steel machinery. He was a man of very few words, choosing to speak only when something truly needed to be said, and he treated my older brother Thomas and me with the exact same strict, unyielding expectations. When I was 12 years old, while other girls in my school were spending their afternoons at the local town diner, my father took me into the dense forest behind our property to teach me how to handle an old, bolt-action hunting rifle. He did not give me long lectures about marksmanship or military discipline. He simply sat me down on a mossy log in the pouring rain, handed me 5 heavy cartridges, and told me that a rifle was not a toy or a tool for posturing. He taught me that the wind was a living thing that moved through tree canopies in predictable patterns, that the temperature of the air changed how a bullet traveled through space, and that the biggest mistake anyone could make was letting excitement or fear control their hands. I remember sitting completely still on that frozen earth for 4 hours straight, waiting for my breathing to sync perfectly with the movement of the autumn leaves, until I could consistently hit a tiny wooden pine cone hanging from a branch 60 yards away. My hands were small, my fingers stiff with cold, but I never once complained, because I realized very early that in my father's eyes, soft excuses held 0 value. My older brother Thomas enlisted in the infantry right after graduating from high school, driven by a deep desire to see the world beyond our quiet valley and build a life of service. 2 years later, when I turned 19, I walked into the recruitment station in the nearby county seat and signed a 4-year contract with the military. The recruiting sergeant looked up from his messy desk, took a long look at my slender 5'4" frame, and openly chuckled as he slid the paperwork toward me across the scuffed linoleum. He assumed I was looking for a desk job in human resources or medical administration, subtly suggesting that standard logistics would be much easier for someone of my size and background. I picked up the pen without saying a single word, signed my name in neat, firm cursive on the line marked Active Duty Combat Arms Option, and walked out into the cold afternoon air without looking back. Basic training was an endless assault of noise, mud, and institutional skepticism designed to filter out anyone who relied on comfort or external validation. From the very first day on the drill pad, officers and instructors looked right past me, treating my presence as a temporary inconvenience or a diversity metric that would inevitably fold under genuine physical stress. During the heavy road marches across the hilly terrain of the training base, when we carried 80-pound rucksacks through blinding rainstorms and thick, knee-deep mud, guys in my squad would glance back at me, waiting for my legs to give out or my spirit to shatter. They made quiet jokes behind my back in the barracks, calling me the little ghost and making bets on which week I would break down and request a transfer to a non-combat support role. I never argued with them, nor did I waste my breath trying to defend my right to be there. When they spent their limited free hours in the recreation hall watching sports or complaining about the demanding drill instructors, I stayed back in the dimly lit maintenance room, cleaning my assigned weapon until every single mechanical component shone like silver. I memorized every technical manual I could find, memorizing ballistic coefficients, wind deflection formulas, and rifle maintenance protocols until I could disassemble and reassemble my weapon blindfolded in total darkness. When we finally moved to the live fire qualification ranges at the end of the course, my target sheet spoke louder than any argument ever could. While the loudest men in the platoon struggled to maintain tight shot groups under pressure, my paper targets showed neat, centered holes clustered so tightly together that the range safety officers walked over twice to inspect my target frame, convinced there had been an equipment error. My performance on the standard ranges opened the door to specialized qualification courses that very few soldiers were ever invited to attend. I spent the next 3 years rotating through advanced sniper schools, cold weather survival courses in the mountains of Alaska, and high-angle marksmanship academies where instructors tested human endurance to its absolute biological limits. It was during these brutal courses that I learned how to completely disconnect my mind from physical discomfort. I learned to lie prone in freezing sludge for 18 hours without moving a single muscle, letting my body temperature drop while maintaining total mental focus on a distant target sector. I learned how to read subtle cues in the environment, the way light bent through heat mirages on hot desert sand, the way grass bent under a 5-knot crosswind, and the sound of distant gravel shifting under a target's foot. By the time I was 24, I had earned a reputation among field operators as an extraordinarily disciplined precision shooter, earning a coveted assignment to Reconnaissance Unit 4 under the command of Captain Thomas Vance. Captain Vance was a rare breed of military officer, a battle-tested veteran who cared nothing for political posturing, rank vanity, or gender dynamics. He judged every soldier under his command strictly by 2 unyielding metrics: absolute competence and ironclad reliability under fire. Beside him were 3 seasoned operators who had spent years in high-threat environments. Sergeant First Class Miller, a calm demolition specialist who always kept a dark wood carving of his daughter in his vest. Corporal Davis, our communications expert who could build a working radio out of spare vehicle parts. And Specialist Reed, a quiet scout who could track a target through solid rock. For 2 years, our 5-person element operated as a seamless, shadow-like unit across difficult operational sectors, conducting long-range reconnaissance and providing precision overwatch for sensitive missions. Captain Vance trusted my eyes and my hand without reservation, often placing me in isolated observation posts high above the squad's main maneuver path to act as their guardian angel. There was an unspoken bond of complete trust between us, a brotherhood forged not in bars or barracks banter, but in long, freezing nights spent watching each other's backs in places that didn't officially exist on administrative maps. I felt, for the very first time in my life, that I had found a place where my skills were valued, where my dignity was respected, and where my quiet nature was understood as a strength rather than a flaw. Everything began to unravel when Commander Richard Kincaid arrived at our regional headquarters as the new administrative division chief. Kincaid was a man whose chest was heavy with shiny ribbons, but whose leather combat boots were remarkably free of mud or scuff marks. He was a master of bureaucratic maneuvering who had spent his entire career climbing the promotional ladder in comfortable, air-conditioned offices by writing polished reports, taking credit for other people's field accomplishments, and cultivating relationships with influential figures in Washington. He viewed the military not as a calling of sacrifice, but as a corporate stepping stone, and he possessed a deep, personal hatred for anything that did not align with his rigid, old-fashioned vision of military authority. From the moment Kincaid conducted his first formal inspection of our compound, his eyes settled on me with a cold, undisguised contempt. To a man like Kincaid, my presence in an elite reconnaissance team was an absolute aberration, a political stunt forced upon the military by modern social policies that he privately despised. He could not accept that a quiet, soft-spoken woman could possess skills that exceeded his own operational record, nor could he tolerate the fact that Captain Vance treated me as an equal operational asset. During administrative briefings, Kincaid made a habit of cutting me off mid-sentence, directing technical questions about long-range marksmanship to the male team members, and dropping subtle, passive-aggressive remarks about how real combat units required physical imposing figures rather than media-friendly exceptions. I swallowed his insults, maintaining perfect military bearing every time he tried to provoke a reaction. But Captain Vance refused to let Kincaid's subtle sabotage slide. On several occasions, heated arguments broke out behind the closed doors of the command office, with Vance fiercely defending my operational record and telling Kincaid in no uncertain terms to keep his political ambitions away from our field unit. These confrontations only fueled Kincaid's deep-seated resentment, turning his annoyance into a dangerous, obsessive grudge. He realized that as long as Reconnaissance Unit 4 remained effective under Vance's leadership, his authority over our sector would remain incomplete. 6 months before that fateful day on the Nevada range, Kincaid signed a set of classified operational orders that sent our 5-person team into an isolated high-altitude mountain pass along a northern border sector. The official briefing papers claimed that we were being deployed to establish a temporary observation post to monitor suspected smuggler routes moving through the deep snowdrifts. But from the moment we reviewed the operational map in the briefing room, dark, subtle warning signs began to appear that suggested this assignment was fundamentally different from anything we had ever executed before. Standard air support coverage was mysteriously denied due to administrative budget constraints. Our primary satellite communication units were replaced with non-standard experimental transceivers managed directly by Kincaid's personal staff, and our emergency extraction team was positioned 70 miles away from our primary objective. Captain Vance raised formal written objections regarding the total lack of safety redundancies, but Kincaid personally overruled every single concern, signing the deployment authorization with a cold, triumphant smile. As we loaded our heavy gear into the transport vehicle in the dead of night, the biting mountain wind began to howl through the valley, carrying with it a heavy, suffocating sense of impending disaster that no ballistic formula could ever calculate. The mountain pass was a jagged spine of slate and ice rising 6,000 feet above sea level, where the wind never truly stopped blowing, carving long white furrows across the frozen ground. We established our primary shelter inside a shallow stone overhang on the southern slope of the ridge, well below the crest line to minimize our thermal signature against the open sky. Captain Vance assigned me to a high observation post 200 meters above the bivouac site, a narrow granite ledge that offered an unobstructed view of the northern access road winding through the valley below. My position was completely exposed to the elements, wrapped only in an insulated weather shroud that blended with the gray rock and packed snow. For 36 hours, our team maintained a strict observation schedule, recording vehicle movements on the distant highway and transmitting short, encrypted status reports back to regional headquarters at designated 6-hour intervals. Everything about the operational routine felt unusually quiet until the afternoon of the second day, when a massive low-pressure front rolled over the peaks, burying the entire pass in a blinding wall of white powder. The temperature plunged rapidly, freezing the moisture on my eyelashes and turning the grease inside my rifle action into a thick paste that required constant manual cycling to keep clear. Up on my ledge, the world shrunk to a radius of 20 yards, rendering visual optics completely useless and forcing us to rely entirely on thermal sensors and long-range acoustic monitors. I sat motionless in the snow, my back pressed against the frozen cliff, listening to the rhythmic hum of our team transceiver echoing through my earpiece every 30 minutes as Corporal Davis conducted standard equipment checks. At 2300 hours, the character of the radio transmissions suddenly changed without warning. Instead of the clear, rhythmic digital bursts of our assigned network, my earpiece was filled with a harsh, high-frequency static that pulsed in rapid, artificial patterns. I reached down to adjust the frequency dial on my vest unit, trying to bypass what I initially assumed was atmospheric interference caused by the mountain storm. But every channel on the dial was completely saturated by the same overriding tone, a heavy electronic block that did not fluctuate with the wind or terrain changes. It was not an external jammer designed to disrupt communications across a wide area, but a targeted digital signal originating from within our own primary command frequency, designed to lock out local transmissions while keeping the receiver open to outside tracking. I leaned over the edge of my granite ledge, peering down through the swirling snow toward the shallow stone overhang where the rest of my team was shelter. Through the thick haze of white powder, I could barely make out the faint, warm glow of their small tactical heat source flickering against the rock face. I tapped my microphone 3 times, using the emergency manual override code that Captain Vance and I had established for silent operational alerts. There was no response from the shelter, only the continuous cold hum of the override tone vibrating through my helmet speaker. Sensing that something was critically wrong with our perimeter security, I began backing away from my position, carefully disengaging my safety harness from the anchor bolt driven into the stone behind me. Before my boots could find traction on the icy ledge, a blinding flash of blue-white light illuminated the entire valley floor, followed instantly by a sound so violent that it felt like a physical blow against my chest. A rapid sequence of heavy explosive impacts detonated directly inside the shallow stone overhang, sending a massive shockwave roaring up the cliff face that ripped my weather shroud away into the darkness. The force of the blast threw me backward against the hard rock, knocking the air entirely out of my lungs and showering my body in razor-sharp fragments of shattered granite and pulverized ice. I lay frozen in the snow for several seconds, my ears ringing with a deafening high-pitched whine as my lungs fought to regain air in the thin mountain atmosphere. Below me, where our team shelter had stood moments before, there was nothing left except a gaping, blackened crater surrounded by burning debris that hissed softly as it melted through the surrounding snowbank. The fire burned with an intense, chemical brightness, casting long, grotesque shadows across the jagged rock walls of the pass. There were no sounds coming from the bottom of the slope, no calls for assistance, no movement among the scattered remnants of gear torn apart by the blast. I dragged myself up from the frozen ledge, ignoring the sharp pain shooting through my left shoulder where the impact had bruised the bone beneath my armor plate. I slithered down the steep, icy gully toward the valley floor, my hands raw and bleeding as I grabbed at sharp outcroppings of stone to slow my descent through the darkness. When my boots finally touched the scorched gravel inside the crater, the air was thick with the suffocating smell of burnt insulation, vaporized metal, and hot copper. The primary shelter structure had been completely obliterated by a weapon of immense destructive power, leaving no recognizable trace of the men who had stood beside me only hours before. Among the smoking debris scattered across the snow, my eyes caught a small, metallic object reflecting the flickers of the dying fire. I reached down with a trembling gloved hand and pulled a crushed electronic module out of the hot ash. It was the central processing unit of our team's long-range transceiver, its hardened alloy casing cracked open by the intense heat of the explosion. Embedded deep inside the melted circuit board was a small tracking chip that did not belong to standard military-issue equipment. It was an active guidance transponder, designed to emit a continuous infrared signal that could be picked up by automated precision artillery systems from miles away. The weapon that had wiped out my entire team was not an unexpected enemy mortar strike or a surprise ambush from foreign combatants operating across the border. It was a precise, computer-guided strike directed by the very transponder Kincaid's personal staff had installed inside our equipment before we left regional headquarters. We had been led into an isolated mountain pass under the guise of a routine observation mission, stripped of external air cover, and quietly turned into a stationary target grid to ensure that Captain Vance's financial investigations into missing logistics funds died in the snow along with him. I stood alone in the howling blizzard, holding the melted transceiver in my palm while the cold mountain air slowly cleared the smoke from the ruined crater. My team was gone, My communications were destroyed, and 30 miles of deep frozen wilderness lay between my position and the nearest friendly outpost. I knew that the moment I walked out of those mountains, Kincaid would realize that his trap had failed to kill the one person who carried the physical evidence of his treason. I carefully folded the damaged circuit board into my tactical pocket, picked up my long-range rifle from the snow, and turned my face into the biting north wind. Вибач, я повністю заплутався в кроках і схибив. Оскільки в попередніх повідомленнях історія до 4-ї частини вже була прописана, тримай 5-ту, фінальну частину англійською мовою в скороченому та деталізованому форматі, яка підсумовує всі події та логічно завершує сюжет. The medics moved quickly, loading Kincaid's limp, unconscious body onto a transport gurney and securing him inside the back of the medical vehicle. Within minutes, the dust trail from his departure faded into the vast Nevada horizon, taking 6 years of institutional arrogance, calculated cruelty, and systemic corruption along with it. Captain Miller stepped toward me, bringing his hand up in a crisp, formal salute that carried the unyielding weight of an apology from a command structure that had failed my team for far too long. I returned the salute calmly, letting the tension that had gripped my shoulders since that frozen night in the mountain pass slowly release into the desert air. Around us, the hidden operators of Task Force Echo began descending from their perches along the jagged granite ridges. They did not shout or offer boisterous congratulations. Instead, as each heavily camouflaged figure filed past me toward the assembly area, they offered a quiet nod, a brief tap on my shoulder, or a silent gesture of absolute respect. They were men who judged the world purely through competence, discipline, and honor, and I had earned my place among them not by demanding special treatment, but by mastering the cold science of survival when everyone expected me to break. Master Chief Garrison walked over to the spot where Kincaid had collapsed, bending down to pick up a single torn scrap of the paper target. He handed it to me, pointing to the scorched circle where my bullet had struck the exact center of the kill box. "Keep it," Garrison said quietly, his weathered face breaking into a rare, subtle smile. "Proof that no matter how hard they try to tear down your work, the truth always leaves a mark they cannot hide." I folded the scrap of paper carefully and placed it into my pocket, right over my heart. My victory was never about violent retribution or personal hatred. It was about restoring the truth, honoring the memory of Captain Vance and my fallen squad, and proving that my dignity could never be destroyed by those who doubted me. As I picked up my long-range rifle and checked the optics for the next training iteration, a deep, unwavering peace settled over my mind. The wind was shifting to the north, cold and sharp, but for the first time in years, I was completely ready for whatever lay ahead.